So the Zube lecture series, just to remind you all, has been set up with an incredibly generous donation from a former department head in the department who left here, went to the University of Arizona, Irv Zube. Irv and Margaret Zube donated the money. They have sadly both passed up by now. But they left us with this wonderful speaker series that we have endowed that let us bring in fantastic people like Chad. And I have the pleasure of introducing him today. So he told me, let me in on the background to his name, Chad Travieso. So Travieso means mischief or mischievous. And so his parents apparently wanted to name him Dennis Travieso? Huh? Gato. Well, Dennis Travieso would be Dennis the Menace, right? Dennis Mischievous. And they wanted to name him Gato Travieso, which would be cat or mischievous cat. So I think that's a perfect introduction to somebody who's an artist, a designer, and an urbanist. Somebody who's willing to break down the walls, not just being a nation of walls. He's the co-founder of Yeju and Chat. He creates participatory architectural and research-based projects that reinforce social bonds, which is fantastic, in public spaces. His honors include a Columbia GASAP Anti-Racism Curriculum Development Award and several artists fellowships and other awards, a United States Artist Fellowship, and those awards go on. In this particular talk, he presents his research project, A Nation of Walls, as you see up behind me, that catalogs the history, physical remnants, and political legacies of race barriers erected to separate white and black neighborhoods throughout the United States. It focuses on walls, fences, barricades, road closures, buffer strips, and he explores how those divided and isolated communities. So when we think of those barriers, we think of isolation and disconnection, and how they acted as overt symbols of exclusion and hostility. So I'm very much looking forward to this lecture. Thank you. Please welcome Chad.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Carrie, for inviting me, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out. It's really an honor to be here today. So as Elizabeth mentioned, today I'm going to discuss my ongoing research project, The Nation of Walls, which catalogs the physical remnants and political legacies of race barriers in the United States. But before I present this work, I'd like to give you some background on what led me to this research, and so you have a bit more context on where I'm coming from. So I'm primarily an artist and designer working at the intersection of public art, architecture, and urban design. The work that I do, both as an independent artist and designer, as well as my collaborative practice, Yeju and Chat, is very much invested in working with what's already happening on the ground in collaboration with communities most impacted by the work. And the key consideration in my practice is creating projects that are sensitive to their specific context. This work isn't about starting from scratch or grand gestures. It's about building on what's already in a place, both physically and socially. And this work isn't separate from its surroundings. It is dependent on them. It considers how our surroundings can be endlessly adaptable, having the potential for multiple uses, which is something that people already do on a daily basis. And objects of exclusion, like walls, fences, barricades, are reoccurring targets for much of my work. These structures are all blunt instruments of architectural control. They're also extremely common built forms. So attaching urban interventions to these structures and rerouting their use simultaneously produces new social relations and calls out their original exclusionary function, all while providing a convenient structural support. This drawing series I created in 2016, titled 101 Ways to Subvert a Wall, illustrates various ideas on how to disregard, appropriate, circumvent, and abolish a wall. I'm also originally from Miami, Florida, and in 2016, I read NDB Connolly's book, A World More Concrete, about the history of real estate and Jim Crow in South Florida. And in that book, Connolly describes several race walls throughout Miami, including one in the Liberty City neighborhood that he describes as being a model for others built throughout the country. And given my interest in walls and fences already, the subject of segregation barriers intrigued me. So I actually emailed Connolly asking for more information if he had any, and he replied that as far as he knew, there was no comprehensive study on this, and every time he read about walls, they were just in passing in books. So that began this research project. And this work, I've been lucky to get support from the Graham Foundation grant, NISCA grant with fiscal sponsorship from Storefront for Art and Architecture, and other funders to be able to do this research. So since 2017, I've uncovered evidence of over 30 still standing, removed, or planned race barriers in 18 states. Turns out Miami has a disproportionate number of these structures. And not surprisingly, there exists a deep difference in experience between those who remember or are not allowed to forget, and those who don't know or refuse to see these structures' purpose. And for this research, I've defined race barriers as walls, fences, barricades, road closures, and buffer strips. And walls, of course, are just one set of forms by which to segregate built space, along with highways, train tracks, low bridges, one-way streets, misaligned city grids, and a lack of sidewalk or crosswalks. And compared to systemic forces like zoning laws, redlining, restrictive covenants, block busting, contract selling, predatory lending, and other forms, not to mention the terror inflicted by vigilante groups and the police, such physical obstructions may seem clumsy, playing a supportive rather than principal role in establishing and preserving racial segregation in this country. But it is precisely in their commonplace visibility that these barriers denote an important chapter in the history of racist building practices and civic administration. Unlike a discriminatory law or withheld opportunity, a race wall is solid, simple, right there at the end of the street. They solidify the social conditions brought about by such policies, remaining to this day oppressively normalized. And it's important to, it's supposed to be black here, it's important to note that exploring histories of oppression and racism often involves confronting offensive and disturbing material. While you may encounter outdated language or unsettling images today, they are used sparingly and within the appropriate context. So for example, they may be included in direct quotations to accurately represent the voices of primary sources of the time, or to expose and illustrate the physical and psychological impact that these fragments of racist infrastructure had on individuals and communities. And to counter the unavoidable accounts of subjugation and violence endemic to this history, this research also endeavors to highlight narratives of Black autonomy, self-determination, resistance, agency, joy, and refusal. For example, this newspaper clipping from 1987 shows people protesting a barricade dividing the majority white Jefferson Parish from neighboring Black sections in New Orleans. And because of this activism, the barricades were bulldozed less than a week after their completion. So I split today's talk into several themes. The first one deals with public housing and racial homogeneity. Next, I'll discuss these walls' connections to redlining and property valuation. After that, we'll talk about the relationship of these barriers to vigilantism and sundown towns, which will lead to talking about the physical reality of these barriers as obstructions, followed by an exploration of the euphemisms used to justify their construction, especially in more recent decades, and how the courts and activists have dealt with these structures. And then finally, I'll end by discussing how certain communities have preserved these structures as an educational tool and the next steps to this research. So in his book, Race, Place, and the Law, 1836 to 1948, legal scholar David Delaney states that, quote, "The history of race relations in the United States have been the history of conflicts over spatial relations," end quote. Indeed, much of what has animated racist ideas and policies in America sprouts from white people's anxiety over and antipathy towards black proximity and mobility. Take, for instance, Miami's Carver Village terror attacks. In 1951, city commissioners allocated units in Knights Manor, an all-white apartment complex, for black housing, renaming this portion Carver Village. This led to bitter opposition from neighboring whites. The KKK and residents launched intimidation tactics and multiple bombings. According to reports at the time, the bombs tore holes in the building's concrete block wall, ripped doors from their hinges, shattered every window, and scores more nearby units, ripped out gas stoves and damaged electric refrigerators in the kitchen, ripped the roof of the buildings, and caused widespread havoc, end quote. This was by no means the only act of domestic white supremacist terror. In Miami or beyond, the homes of African Americans integrating all white areas were frequently firebombed. By destroying homes, the perpetrators destroyed livelihoods, traumatized families, stunted wealth accumulation, and sent an unwelcoming message to any other black residents aspiring to relocate into the neighborhood. But what makes the Carver Village incident notable is that when the initial black tenants moved into the apartment complex, they not only breached an imaginary racial boundary, they actually crossed a literal concrete wall. What's more, this wall was planned by the municipal government, supported by the U.S. Housing Authority, and designed by an architect. This particular wall, which was built in conjunction with the expansion of Liberty Square public housing development during the New Deal, is a good place to start as it combines many of the motives that drove the construction of several other walls that came after it. It acted as a pretext to procure the necessary permits and approvals from local governments, was a way for the county and city officials to mollify hostile white residents, was a form of intimidation itself and marked the boundary of a sundown town, and was used to enforce racial homogeneity within public housing and adjacent neighborhoods. So the construction of public housing, while it provided affordable and decent homes for many working families, accelerated the process of segregation in this country. Early public housing had a rule that the development had to respect the racial makeup of the neighborhood within which it was placed, but the New Deal's Public Works Administration segregated public housing, even in areas that were previously integrated. A way this was enacted and affirmed was through physical barriers to demarcate the border between these different neighborhoods. So Liberty Square was one of the first public housing projects for African Americans in the country. The segregated development was constructed in the 1930s under the Public Works Administration to relieve substandard conditions in Overtown, one of the few areas where black people were allowed to live at the time. A collection of 1- and 2-story buildings with open space between, Liberty Square was praised as an exemplary modern development at the time, featured in the May 1937 issue of Architectural Record. Yet housing needs remain so dire for Miami's black population that the city soon approved an expansion of Liberty Square, prompting strong objections from white residents who had been promised a 20-acre buffer strip between their neighborhood and the housing project. As a concession, in 1939, city officials and the project's architect, backed by the U.S. Housing Authority, erected the wall and screened it with tall Australian pines. It's striking to see this rendering of the wall from 1939. Despite the visible presence of the wall, and you can see the pines and this ominous figure with a suit in the background, there are signals of community in the foreground with people gathering around the fruit stand. And this is something I heard from residents I interviewed, that while they were aware of the wall and its purpose, it did not define their day-to-day life. Here's the deed for the expanded Liberty Square blocks with the wall visible on the site plans. You can see it says 5 feet high concrete block wall. And in an interview with Hattie and Philip Walker, former Liberty Square residents and founders of the organization Liberty Square Friends and Family, knew that, quote, that wall was to keep us out, end quote. And Mr. Walker added that, quote, we were boxed in, end quote. For community leaders and community leader and former Liberty Square resident Melba Rose, she knew from an early age that she could not cross it. Quote, the police would always come by the wall on their motorcycles. They would ensure that you didn't exercise your right to go to the white side of town, end quote. Over time, the wall was lowered, sections were removed to open road access, and white residents fled the area. And remnants of the wall are visible to this day, yet for someone who might not know this history, they might mistake the structure as an unassuming retaining wall. In their bluntness and ordinariness, these race barriers or segregation walls tend to hide in plain sight. Another example of a wall used to segregate public housing from an adjacent neighborhood was in Houston, Texas, where the Houston Housing Authority constructed a brick wall in the 1950s to separate San Felipe Courts, a white public housing development, from nearby Freedmanstown, a black neighborhood that was the original site where formerly enslaved people settled in Houston starting in 1865 after the Civil War. The image here is an example of Freedmanstown, what it looked like. And in the words of a Houston housing official at the time, the wall was intended to separate the races, quote, psychologically and physically. And this wall was demolished in the 1970s. And in the 1940s, when the Tampa Housing Authority constructed the all-black College Hill homes adjacent to the all-white Ponce de Leon courts, it separated the two public housing projects with a 500-foot buffer strip, a playground for white children only, and a fence topped with barbed wire. The fence remained until also the 1970s when Ponce de Leon was legally integrated and most white residents moved out. And finally, along the border between New Haven and Hamden in Connecticut, in the early 1950s, the Housing Authority of New Haven helped pay for the construction of a 12-foot chain link fence as a compromise with white Hamden residents who objected to the construction of nearby public housing. Black residents had to take several long bus rides to reach jobs and shops across the fence. According to a New York Times article, in 2005, under the guise of repairs, Hamden added a second, sturdier fence, which rises in places to 16 feet. A few parts of the structure were torn down by the city of Hamden in 2014 to allow road access in response to pressure from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, but not without opposition from Hamden residents. So race barriers do more than underscore the lengths to which white communities have gone to sustain segregation. As a means by which to preserve differentials in the valuation of adjacent properties, they cast into relief the racism endemic to the U.S. real estate market. As Adrienne Brown, scholar Adrienne Brown states in her essay, Appraisal Narratives, Reading Race on the Mid-Century Block, quote, the point of residential appraisal forms, it seems, was not necessarily to provide an empirically accurate reading of a block's social and racial demographics, but to successfully speculate how bodies would commonly be read and reacted to by the average white home buyer, the figure around which real estate markets in the United States were designed to serve, end quote. Nowhere is this entrenched discrimination clearer than in the connection between race walls and redlining. The influence of residential security maps compiled for the federal government by the Home Owners Loan Corporation from 1935 to 1940, maps on which black and racially mixed areas were deemed high risk for federal lenders and tinted red for, quote, hazardous, is well known. Race walls cast these exclusions into actual concrete. Indeed, at mid-century, realty companies seeking to build in redline zones sometimes installed walls specifically in order to qualify for federal loans, as physical barriers were considered a benefit for Federal Housing Administration appraisers. And as this FHA underwriting manual from 1938 states, quote, natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood from adverse influences. Usually the protection from adverse influences afforded by these means include lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups, end quote. Consider Detroit in 1941. A developer wished to build an all-white subdivision to the west of a black neighborhood known as 8 Mile, Wyoming. So you can see here where the wall is. That's the red line zone. The developer struck a deal with the Federal Housing Administration to erect a half-mile concrete wall in return for FHA-approved financing and mortgage guarantees. 8 Mile residents protested. Reverend Horace A. Wright, a state representative and member of the Detroit Housing Commission, was quoted in a newspaper as cautioning that the wall would be, quote, a serious handicap to the unity that we are striving for. Even in the South, they wouldn't do anything like that. And parts of the wall are still there. And in West Texas, in the town of Crane, a wall also built in the 1940s cut off the black sections of town from a whites-only development. Like the Detroit Wall, a physical barrier between the races was mandated by the FHA in order for the developer to obtain FHA-insured loans. And the ruins of that wall are also still visible. And again, back in Miami, this time in a neighborhood called Coconut Grove, yet another wall was the result of a quid pro quo with the FHA. The Coconut Grove wall, like so many others, was built in the post-war decades in the 1940s to appease white residents, in this case a group protesting construction of affordable all-black duplexes in what was then known as the St. Albans Tract. After a multi-year rezoning battle between builders and white homeowners, the latter compromised, quote, under a tentative agreement that St. Albans Tract owners would grant a 30-foot buffer strip, a 6-foot wall topped with wire, then a 50-foot street with a row of single-family houses on the farther side of the street, end quote. In exchange, white residents would drop objections, clearing the way for developers to access FHA mortgages. And the Coconut Grove Wall still marks actually the border between the historically black and white sections of Miami's Coconut Grove. So here you can see the redlining map from the 1930s where the wall still is. And here you can see an aerial view, and you can see how the tree canopy is different. And aligns with the redlining map, which also aligns with where the wall is, putting into sharp relief how this systemic plunder and dispossession has created visible and lived disparities to this day. And the extant Coconut Grove Wall was not the first proposal in the neighborhood. Some years before, a different realty company, also looking to build housing for African Americans, had petitioned the city's planning board to extend the de facto racial boundary lines. As part of its proposal, the company offered, in the words of its attorney, to put in a wall, quote, similar to the one the United States government constructed when they separated Liberty Square project from the white section, end quote. This wall was never built because more than 200 angry white homeowners overwhelmed the planning board hearing on the matter. So as the federal government and local municipalities across the nation deployed discriminatory housing policies and allowed racist real estate practices to produce and uphold racial apartheid in the U.S., white communities, often assisted by the police and excused by the courts, have turned to harassment, vandalism, arson, bombings, riots, murders, and other forms of violence to control and limit where and how African Americans occupy and move through space. In some cases, walls were deemed insufficient, like we just heard about in Coconut Grove, and around the same time as the Coconut Grove Wall in an area of Miami known as the Pinewood neighborhood, city commissioners signaled a tentative approval for construction of a black, quote, village on the condition that developers provide, quote, for the complete segregation of the area, end quote, by establishing a park and shopping district as buffers, along with a 6-foot segregation wall. This did not stop 200 KKK members from burning crosses at the 4 corners of the project site. A few days later, 500 white Pinewood residents flooded a zoning board hearing, resulting in the board's unanimous rejection of the black development. In other cases, the barrier served as the first line of intimidation to black residents on the other side, especially in what were called or known as sundown towns. Countless white communities throughout much of the 20th century not only prevented black families from moving in next door, they also formally and informally banned African Americans from even entering after dark under the threat of arrest or worse. Some of these white communities employed barriers to mark the boundaries of their so-called sundown towns. Take, for instance, North Brentwood, an African-American suburb in Maryland near Washington, D.C., where into the 1960s, black residents knew not to cross a road barricade that divided the community from the white neighborhood of Brentwood or risk violence again from the KKK. The barricade still stands to this day. And in Lake Worth, Florida, a wall the length of 4 football fields continues to enclose the historic African-American neighborhood of Osborne from the rest of the city. As told by former city commissioner Retha Lowe in a 2019 interview, in the 1950s, quote, if a black person worked downtown at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they had to be off the street and had to be back down here in Osborne, end quote. So race barriers go beyond enabling vigilante terror. They physically restrict movement, denying easy access into white areas and forcing black people to take lengthy and burdensome routes to reach important amenities. In their ability to inhibit people's full freedom, these exclusionary structures are a form of physical, social, and psychological abuse in themselves. As legal scholar Sarah Schindler states in her essay, Architectural Exclusion, Discrimination, and Segregation through Physical Design of the Built Environment, quote, by structuring our relationships, these features of the built environment control and constrain our behavior. The architected urban landscape regulates, and the architecture itself is a form of regulation, end quote. In Arlington, Virginia, between the historically African-American community of Halls Hill and what is now the Waycroft Woodlawn neighborhood, a nondescript patchwork of walls and fences hugs property lines. Built in the 1930s during the construction of the whites-only Woodlawn Village subdivision, the barriers blocked all but one through street. But in the 1950s, kids removed a segment to reach a creek. But even so, a few years later, when the county desegregated its schools, Halls Hill children assigned to Woodlawn Elementary had to walk 18 blocks around. Pushed by Halls Hill parents, in 1966, the county opened passage for a single road. Quote, you couldn't get but one way in and one way out, end quote, recalls a neighborhood resident named Mervyn Williams up on the hill, an oral history of Halls Hill neighborhood in Arlington County, Virginia. Quote, this was boxed in down here, similar to what Mr. Walker mentioned earlier. And this fence erected in the late 1940s to keep black residents in the Como neighborhood from entering the affluent white area known as Wrigley in Fort Worth, Texas, blocked access to doctors, dentists, and shops into the 1970s. Taking matters into their own hands, Como youth dug a hole under the so-called Wrigley Wall so that they would not have to walk all the way around to get to their jobs. As community members recall, we'd go down, quote, we'd go down to the hole and slip under, my cousin and I. This was from a documentary about the Como history. They would then go to the country club in Wrigley where they worked as caddies. After work, they would crawl back under the barrier to return to their homes in Como. And, you know, it's not surprising that over the years, ad hoc access solutions like those devised by Halls Hill kids wanting to play in the creek or Como residents trying to get to work have been common. Frequently, these jury-rigged alterations have been experienced by several generations. In Melbourne, Florida, a half-mile concrete wall separating the predominantly white Sunwood Park from the majority African-American Booker T. Washington area continues to block a direct path to the elementary school. The developers of Sunwood Park built the wall in 1959 in opposition to the county's plan to construct a public housing project. But as I was told in 2019 by a community member in an interview, quote, to this day, no school buses come around here, end quote. Ms. Clark, Pauline Clark, who I spoke with, was born in the late 1970s and lived in Booker T. Washington all her life. Quote, a ditch runs along the wall, end quote, she explained. And, quote, because the city refused to pave over it and make a sidewalk, we would place wooden boards over the ditch to prevent our shoes from getting wet on the way to school when we were kids. Eventually, they built a sidewalk, but that's where they would put the board. And communities seeking to erect barriers, particularly in recent decades, have often resorted to euphemistic language about safety and calm. Such groups typically reject imputations of racist intent, and courts frequently uphold their assertions. A landmark case in this regard is City of Memphis v. Green, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1981. The plaintiffs, black residents in Memphis, Tennessee, brought suit to remove a barricade or a road closure that had been built in 1974 at the urging of white Memphians who argued for what they presented as traffic control in order to protect, quote, the safety and tranquility of a residential neighborhood, end quote. The court sided with the white defendants, arguing that the street closing represented nothing more than a, quote, routine burden of citizenship and a slight inconvenience. Thurgood Marshall, who was a Supreme Court justice at the time, could see that claims regarding traffic were, quote, code phrases for racial discrimination, end quote. In his dissent, Justice Marshall emphasized the psychological and social effects of such exclusions, stating that the majority's analysis, quote, ignores the plain and powerful symbolic message of the inconvenience, end quote. And further emphasizing the harmful emotional consequences of these obstructions and expressing a feeling that undoubtedly is shared by others who've had to experience the effects of these barriers, Black Memphian N.T. Green, in a 1981 Supreme Court testimony against the barricades, put it this way, quote, because we are black, we cannot drive through a piece of property that is owned collectively by us. This would cause psychological damage to me personally, adding that Memphis street closure is simply an extension of the insult and humiliation that we have tolerated and experienced too long already. And this Memphis barricade is also still standing. And in 1998, with the support of HUD, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City constructed an 8-foot spiked wrought iron fence around Hollander Ridge, a predominantly African-American public housing development located at the border between the city of Baltimore and the majority white suburb of Rosedale. In a case that went to trial in 2003, black public housing tenants filed Thomas v. HUD, a federal civil rights lawsuit against HUD, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, and the City of Baltimore, Judges sided with the tenants in ruling that HUD had actually failed to manage housing programs in a way consistent with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but they disagreed that the fence itself had been built for discriminatory reasons, even if some Rosedale residents who called for its construction had racist motives. And this Hollander Ridge was raised in 2000, but that fence is still there. And this banner, installed by a group of protesters who had been fighting for nearly 15 years to remove barriers between the suburb of Shaker Heights and the city of Cleveland, the Shaker Heights officials, the barricade were quote-unquote traffic diverters, but on the other side, they were known as the, quote, Berlin Wall for Black people. And this Berlin Wall actually shows up a lot in a lot of these barriers. In the 1980s, a suit by the city of Cleveland reached the state Supreme Court. As in the city of Memphis v. Green, the majority here also ruled that the barricade could remain. But in some cases, activists have been successful in removing these barriers. So in December of 1962, the then mayor of Atlanta, Ivan Allen Jr., ordered the construction of wood barricades across Peyton and Harlan roads to keep Black Atlantans from accessing the white neighborhood of Peyton Forest after a Black surgeon named Dr. Clinton Warner purchased a home in that area. And the action was met with strong opposition from Atlanta civil rights groups. Protesters formed picket lines around the barrier, deeming it Atlanta's Berlin Wall, and immediately filed lawsuits in local courts. But as told by historian Kevin M. Cruz, some activists went further. They, quote, pulled the I-beams out of the ground, sawed the timber in half, and tossed the scraps into the nearby creek, end quote. And after whites restored the roadblock the next day, they, quote, the raiders returned and set fire to the new barricade. End quote. Eventually, a judge ordered the barricades be removed 72 days after they were originally erected. And in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, residents also took matters into their own hands. Also dubbed the Berlin Wall, Black residents tore down sections of it in the 1960s when they began to move into the white side of the wall. More recently, in 2017 and 2018, in Palm Springs, California, residents from the historically African-American neighborhood of Crossley Tract successfully pushed the city to remove a row of tall tamarisk trees that stood between their neighborhood and a golf course. And residents believe the trees were planted decades ago to segregate the neighborhood from the rest of Palm Springs, keeping their property values low. Now that the trees are gone, Crossley Tract residents have an unobstructed view of the mountains in the distance. And just last year, Morgan State University in Baltimore tore down a brick wall built in the late 1930s to separate the HBCU from a nearby white area. So some communities indeed have chosen not to take down these race walls, but to add a marker to ensure that no one forgets the discriminatory history, or paint, in some cases they've also painted murals on these barriers to transform their significance. For example, the wall in Crane, Texas that I mentioned earlier has a plaque. There's also one, there's a wall in the Frogtown neighborhood in Columbia, South Carolina that got a plaque recently. And the Halls Hill community in Virginia celebrated a similar unveiling in 2017 after the Halls Hill Highview Park Historic Preservation Coalition pushed Arlington County to erect also a plaque there. But even so, when portions of the wall were destroyed in a 2019 flash flood, some welcomed the change. Quote, "To be able to stand in Halls Hill and look over into Woodlawn is just amazing to me," end quote. Resident Sandra Green told the reporter, "I just never thought I'd see it." And the wall in 8 Mile in Detroit no longer blocks streets, and the neighborhoods on both sides are now almost entirely black. And Detroit activists argued that it was important to acknowledge the wall as a relic of segregation. And in 2006, the community covered it with murals that celebrate community leaders. And actually in 2019, when presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Warren unveiled her housing plan, she did so in a video shot besides the remaining segments of the 8 Mile wall, making her argument about redlining more visible and tangible. And Retha Lowe, who I mentioned earlier, the city commissioner in Lake Worth, Florida, likewise felt that the Osborne Wall should be reclaimed. And in 1994, she talked residents into painting it instead of tearing it down. Quote, "The wall does not really separate us anymore," Ms. Lowe stated at the time of the mural's completion. "The wall belongs to us. You can take a wrong and make it a right out of it." The structure was renamed the Wall of Unity, but there's still just one street in and out of Osborne to this day. And the wall in Melbourne also has a mural organized by the Brevard Neighborhood Development Coalition as part of an effort to revitalize the neighborhood. The painting features key figures in Black history and was designed and installed by local youth working with an arts educator. But here again, however, inequities persist. The wall still impedes direct paths from the Booker T. Washington area to the nearest school. And there are limits to what a mural or a plaque can rectify. So thinking about other ways we can approach these barriers as living monuments and create the conditions in which local communities have the power and resources to determine what happens with these structures, I want to end this talk by talking a bit about this youth education project I've co-created and have been involved in that I did and worked on concurrent to A Nation of Walls research. And I also would like to discuss a bit more about my hopes of where this research is going. So Wall In was a multi-year youth summer arts education program and public art initiative. I co-developed the project with playwright Terrell Alvin McCraney, architect Jermaine Barnes, and Arts for Learning Miami. And I was the lead educator and facilitator for the project from 2017 to 2019. And for this project, local youth who live in or near the Liberty City neighborhood investigated the history of that Liberty City wall. And research that they did included interviews with community members and leaders. The quotes, Miss Walker, Mr. Walker, Miss Rose, were all conducted with the youth that I mentioned earlier. For this project, and they also went to the archives, the Black archives, and then they did some observing and mapping exercises as well. And after researching the history of the walls and thinking about their own experiences in the community, the youth created public art proposals in response to that research, as well as their own personal experiences and connections to the community. And the group created 4 distinct proposals in 2018 of different scales and scopes. And they also activated the space with temporary interventions. So the intention for this project was for local youth to be agents of change in their own community by reclaiming a grim chapter in history and shaping their surroundings. And the project presents also the potential for pedagogy as a form of experimental archiving. And finally, in terms of A Nation of Walls research, I see this work that I presented today as the first phase of an ongoing long-term research project that would be fully realized through the creation of a digital database and interactive website. This next phase would present this little documented history in a website that plots and classifies these structures on an interactive map, provides information about each barrier, and offers a place for community members to share their stories. Being that there's so little documentation of these structures, there will be a function on the website that invites visitors to post markers on the map for barriers not yet listed. And the hope is that this participatory research tool would give community members and historians the opportunity to add to this research and voice their experiences, emphasizing that the story of these barriers and their effects is still being written and belongs to the communities that have been most impacted by these structures and the racist policies that put them there. Its aim is not only to uncover this history to the wider public, but also, more importantly, to create a space for remembrance and action. And as one of the Wall and